Hi there. I want to take some time today to talk a little bit about work and our ideas of work. And while my work is generally with an organization that I started called the Self Project, which is designed primarily for educators and parents of adolescents, which is 10 to 22-year-old ish. Um, I think this is super important work actually for all of us to do. The Self Project was designed to really help adolescents and teens learn about how to manage stress and anxiety, and also to think about what it means to be in relationship and how to develop healthy relationships and how to build resilience and sort of create networks and communities that are really healthy and intentional. And so my work with educators and parents is really designed to help to have them help teenagers do this and to also really have healthy relationships with teenagers. Um, a big part of that is us as the adults in the room, the parents, the caregivers, the educators, the school administrators, the school counselors, doing our own really important inquiry and sort of unpacking our ideas about certain important aspects of things and what our expectations are for teenagers and adolescents. And now, during this time where educators are trying to figure out how to educate kids online and really in different creative ways, and where a lot of parents and caregivers are at home in close quarters with their adolescents and teens in ways that we generally aren't. I think it's really, really important to unpack our ideas of work. So I've created this worksheet. I feel like I'm going to be saying the word work a lot during this time. Anyway, I've created this worksheet that is a downloadable PDF, and I will have it available on my website for folks who want to print it out and do it on their own. Take your time. Know the important thing when you do this worksheet is that you're not judgy about it. Don't judge yourself. Um, don't jump into that mindset of either, hey, I'm really good at this, pat myself on the back, or dang, I'm really an awful human being, or that's a really messed up thought. This is information. This is about being really mindful and thinking critically about the ways that we use these sort of bedrock notions um, to go about our lives, and really examining what those bedrock notions are and why they're important. It's almost like doing the work of implicit bias and really unpacking some of those critical questions. So um, there are three really big questions on this worksheet, and the first one has many, many subcategories, and I'm just going to go through them a little bit and kind of talk you through them. The website is theselfproject.com, theselfproject.com. And the worksheet will be on there for you to download if you want to take a second to pause the video and download it and print it out, or have it sort of on a split screen so that you can follow along. That's great. If you want to just watch this first and look at it later, that's perfectly fine as well. So diving in, here's the first question that I'm inviting you to think about, and that is, what was I taught as a child about work? What were my personal influences regarding work? And those influences can come from family. They can come from our particular culture. They can come from the larger society. They can come from religion. Those are the four major kinds of influences that most of us grow up with in one way or another. And they inform our ideas about a lot of really important bedrock things. So the sub-questions here are really trying to get at that, sort of unpacking that question. We can all maybe jot down a few ideas. What was I taught about work? Well, work is important. Well, everybody has to do work. Well, work is how you put food on the table. Work is worth money, whatever. You just, again, no judgment, just writing down those answers. But some of the sub-questions, the first one is, what does work look like to me? What are my ideas? Like, how do I recognize that somebody else or myself is working? Is there some tangible product? Is there some physical effort? Is there like a constant or sustained effort? Like, is somebody working if they're training for a marathon? Is that work? Is that something that's incremental and over time is really important? Are those different kinds of work of varying levels of importance? Is training for a marathon not as much work as inventing a new product or writing computer code? So just, again, this is information. This is important for us to kind of unpack. The second sub-question is, why is work important? And that might feel like a really weird question, especially as we're all sort of, yes, we have these bedrock beliefs about something. Well, of course work is important, but why? What is important about it? Is it important sort of in and of itself as a moral imperative? Like if you're not working, then you're useless. We're human beings designed to work. Is work important for me personally as a way to prove my individual worth? So are the kinds of work that I do really important? Was I, as a kid, told, I should be an attorney or a physician or a priest? And does that speak to my individual worth? What if I chose to be a taxi driver? What if I chose to be a stay-at-home parent? Are those things gender dependent? That's a really important question. Do I think that work is important for the greater good, right? And how is that tied up with ideas of sacrifice and sacrificing to the greater good? Is it important for me, if I choose to be a caregiver whose work is not financially compensated very well, is that work important because I'm sacrificing a big paycheck for the greater good because this work needs to be done? Is that, like, what does that look like? Is my work as a day laborer or a migrant worker equally as important as my work as a receptionist in an office building? What's important, and how do we decide which work is important? The next question is, who does work? Who does work? Does everybody work? Do only some people work? How do I feel about everyone working or only some people working? What does that feel like to me? Does it feel, does it make me angry if I think that not everybody works? Or do I think that some people deserve to not have to work? Is there this, the notions of retiring at 65 years old? Do I believe that people over 65 have worked enough and they shouldn't have to work? Do I believe that people under the age of 14 shouldn't have to work, right? We have all these societal expectations around how old can you be? What if you don't need a work permit because you're working for a family business? So maybe you grew up on a farm and you learned how to help work when you were 8 or 10 years old or younger, right? What does that mean? And who has to work when? The next question is, how is work valued? And who decides what the value is? Who decides what the value of work is? Who gets to decide that this person gets compensated this much and this person gets compensated this much for their amount of work, and why? Why do we believe that some people deserve to be compensated exponentially more than other people? Is it how much money that their work generates? Is it how many things their work produces, or the rate of production if I'm super fast? Those are important questions. Who has the authority to decide how much work is enough? Who gets to decide 40 hours of work a week is plenty? But we don't pay some people a living wage, and so some people are working 80 hours a week. Some people are working 80 hours a week because they want to. Some people are because they have to. How do we decide what kind of work is valuable? What is the relationship of work to rest? So how much work is enough? And who deserves to rest? Is it people who do physical labor? Do they deserve more rest? Or do they not deserve as much because their work isn't valued financially as much as other people? What is the relationship of work to learning and mistakes? And this is a really important one, especially when it comes to our kids, because are we able to recognize work even when it doesn't produce what we think it will? So if we give kids a particular assignment, or we give them a particular chore, and they do something creative, or they fall a little bit short of our expectation, can we still recognize that they did work, that they put in effort? Or is there a direct relationship between the work and the product? Or does my idea of work allow for learning and missteps? So if I'm going to give you a really complicated calculus problem that I know is going to take multiple steps, do I only care about the outcome? Do I care more about the process? Do I care more about giving you lots and lots of chances to practice and seeing some sort of improvement? Do I care if it comes easily to you or not? So how do we think about learning and mistakes in terms of work? Those are all really, really big questions. They're really big questions. And they're things, I think, that will take us some time to kind of unpack. Again, I think it's really important to not get bogged down in judgment, or like, well, that's the way the world is. And, I don't have any control over that. Because, again, we're all operating from a place of these base assumptions around work. And then when we're assigning work to other people, like our children or our students, we're operating from that base. If we don't examine that base and sort of see where we are with that and what that actually means, and how many of those things are valid and reflect our own personal values versus the ones that were maybe just handed down to us, that we're just operating on autopilot, then we risk messing up a relationship with our kids, or giving them an impression that we value something that we actually don't value, or that we don't want to value. So thinking critically about this kind of stuff in relationship to, what are my actual values? Is it more important to me that my kid shows work, that they've done work, whatever that looks like? Or is it more important to me that they're learning and that they're putting in some effort and that they're able to value their own time and effort? So those are really important questions. The second question is really getting to the heart of how we relate to our kids. and what sort of invisible expectations we're giving them or invisible messages we're sending them. So that question is, if work is in some part tied up with effort, right? So if we're saying that it's not necessarily always that product that you've created, but I want to know that you did something to get there, that there was some blood, sweat, and tears involved, or that there was some agonizing, or that there was some learning, or whatever. So there's some effort, right? So if work is in some part tied up with effort, can we acknowledge that there are invisible efforts that are valuable? And what I mean by that is, if I'm a student who really learns best in physical proximity to other people, or by using my hands, by being able to take something apart and put it back together, by doing experiments, by, this kind of manipulating things, if that is the way that I'm wired as a person, and now all of a sudden I'm expected to sit in an online classroom and look at, little window pane thumbnail pictures of my classmates and learn primarily in an auditory and somewhat visual way, but I don't have things to manipulate. It's going to take me a lot more effort, me personally, to manage that learning experience. It might take me a lot more time. I might need to make my own models to manipulate and figure out and play with. I might need to doodle and sketch, but there may not be time for that while I'm trying to pay attention to this. So there's that kind of effort. There's the kind of effort that that is around settling my nervous system. I mean, during this particular time, our nervous systems are jacked right now. Teenagers more than anybody else, and adolescents, because they run on emotion and their fight or flight systems are really, really heightened during this period of time in their lives developmentally. And so finding ways to get out of that adrenaline fight or flight sort of confusion, not knowing what's going to happen or how long this is going to go on, or what to expect with regard to really anything, it's going to take a lot to settle, to find creative ways to continue learning. Because when our fight or flight systems are hijacked and we're really in that loop of, I don't know what's happening, I don't know what to expect, I'm kind of scared, I'm not really sure there's anything I can do, I have no control over this. The portion of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, that is responsible for hearing, processing language, for learning and encoding memory, and for rational thinking, is really quiet. It doesn't really work. When we're in fight or flight, we react. We don't learn. We don't really hear. The auditory centers in our brain are not really processing what we're hearing. We are way more attuned to body language and facial expressions, and we're much more likely to ruminate and get into that spiral of, I'm feeling helpless, I'm feeling hopeless, I'm feeling helpless, I'm feeling hopeless. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to react to any of this. It is work to calm yourself. It takes energy. It takes effort. But that's invisible work. And so, can we think about other kinds of work that our kids are really doing right now that is valuable? and that might be interfering with the kind of work that we really wish they were doing instead. Because here's the other thing about teens is they are social creatures. And during this particular developmental time of their lives, their social connections are directed outside of the family. And that's by design. It is so that when they do go out into the greater world, they have practice identifying members of their larger network and community that are safe and trustworthy, and that sort of will be their tribe. That's really important for them. That's really important work. They're also really sensitive to being pulled back from that sort of social interaction. And that social interaction is not the same virtually as it is in person, which, again, I think most of us are recognizing during this time. I've heard from a lot of people that, the online Zoom calls are exhausting, that they're more tired after an online Zoom meeting than they would have been in a personal one for some reason, and that's perplexing to us. And that has to do, again, with us working to calm our nervous systems. So I know that a lot of educators are already adept at recognizing different ways of learning, that each student has different ways of learning, but it's important for us to also recognize and validate different ways of working or different ways of showing that we're working. And so if we use those tangible outcomes of, did you finish all your homework? What grade did you get on it? How many hours a day did you spend studying or working on that paper? We're not validating the other kinds of invisible work that our kids are doing. And we may be asking them to do an extraordinary amount of work that they're simply not able to sustain right now. It's probably really unfair to be expecting them to do what they've always done, only at home and online in the midst of all of this. And a lot of that, I want to go back to the question about rest. So what's the relationship of work to rest? And how do we know when we need rest? And how do we know when we've done enough work? And how do we know how to gauge which work is important? And can we acknowledge that resting is an important part of work? And I think a lot about sort of the natural world when I think about these questions. When we, plant bulbs in the fall and then they magically pop up in the spring, there has been both rest and work happening during those months that we didn't see. And just because we didn't see it doesn't mean it wasn't happening. And it doesn't mean that there can't be something positive that comes out of that. There's not one thing in nature that doesn't have a natural rest period. And not only day and night rest periods, but seasonal rest periods. And so I think that that's another thing to think about, is how does that rest also translate to work, and how can we also think about it being valuable. And the last question is around, it's very somewhat similar to the second question, but it's around recognizing that different people have different approaches and barriers to the same tasks. And that for some people, that invisible work means that they're doing an exponential amount of effort compared to somebody else, depending on learning differences, depending on trauma history, depending on the ways that we process information and experience the world, depending on our neurological state at any and physiological state at any given moment in time, depending on how much sleep we've gotten. There's a variety of factors that are going to affect the way that we approach work, the length of time we're able to sustain work without rest, and the kinds of barriers that we have. So you can have, 3 different workers that are all in the same position in your company, and they're all contracted for 40 hours a week. And they may have very different productivity levels over time. And a lot of that is going to have to do with their history, with, the way that they learned how to work, and what, do they experience barriers because of external factors, what's happening at home? Are they someone who is particularly well suited to this kind of work and what you're asking of them? So it's really important for us to understand who our kids are and what kinds of challenges they're facing. And I can illustrate this in a couple of ways. One is I knew a child in elementary school who had a sensory processing difference. And that meant that this child was incredibly overwhelmed by all sorts of things that many other kids are not overwhelmed by. This child was very overwhelmed in a movie theater because it was so loud, and there was it was dark, and the soundtrack was loud, and there was all this activity on the screen, and it was just like overwhelmed this child's nervous system to the point where they couldn't retain any of the details of the actual story that was taking place. This child really was stressed out by certain fabrics on their skin, and that was super distracting for them. So for this child to be able to sit still in an elementary classroom where there were lots of bright colors and things all over the walls, where there were kids, maybe there was one kid next to this child, tapping their foot, and the other person was whispering to a friend, and then somebody was passing a note over here, and then the teacher was up there demonstrating something. It was an inordinate amount of work for this student to simply calm their nervous system and be able to absorb any of the formal information that was being sent to them from the teacher and block out all of this other stuff. And by the end of the day, every day, this child completely melted down because their nervous system was so overwhelmed, and they had done so much work to keep it together during the day. And now all of a sudden, when they could let loose and they were no longer in the classroom, blah, okay, thank goodness, right? There's another child who is an extreme introvert who finds it really difficult to make social connections with other students and feels intimidated and overwhelmed by those social connections. Nevertheless, this child managed to make 3 really good, close friends when they were in middle school. And the parent often lamented that when there was a birthday party or, or a big sleepover, that this child didn't want to go because it felt incredibly overwhelming. And then when it was their birthday party, there were only 2 or 3 kids on the invitation list because the parent was really invested in having their child be loved and be popular. And what this child was able to say as they got older was, it was so much work for me to make these 3 really close friends. And I need to be done now for a while. I'm okay with it. I feel okay with it. I'm tired and I'm good with these 3 friends. And I think that was a big eye-opener for the parent to understand that while that wouldn't have been their experience, and it certainly wasn't the experience they wanted for their child, that acknowledging and respecting the fact that this child had worked very hard to get to where they were and that was okay was a big deal. And validating that and recognizing it and letting it be was key for this parent to remain in relationship with their child. And so going back to what I wanted to talk about from the beginning, it is if we can, as the adults, unpack our ideas of what work means and decide for ourselves which of those ideas reinforce our own values and which of those ideas actually run counter to our own values, then we can communicate to our children what we mean by work and what kind of work is valued by us. And we can also maybe make some space to acknowledge that our kids might have different ideas of work than we do. And they might have different values around work than we do. And opening up space for those conversations is going to strengthen our relationships with these young people. And I think it also has the side effect of helping us be more gentle with ourselves. Because I know that there have absolutely been times in the last 2 weeks where I've been working from home where I have looked at the clock and said, it's not 5 o'clock yet. Have I done enough today? What else can I do that would be productive? Are there emails I can send? Are there things on my to-do list? Is there more work I can generate? Or is there work I've been neglecting that I really need to dive into? And I've made myself feel like I needed to be doing a particular amount of work during this time without taking a moment to recognize that the work that I'm doing to make sure that my family and my home are safe, to worry about the people in my community that may not be safe and reach out to them, and to find ways to calm my own nervous system during this time are work. And they're valuable and they're important. And yes, there's the reality of if I don't do enough work, I won't get paid. That is absolutely an important consideration. But it's also important to consider how much of the work that I'm doing is sustainable. Can I sustain at this pace? And which of this work is necessary? And that might change over time. Right now, it feels necessary to check in on my mom, to check in on my daughter who's across the country. It feels necessary to find time to meditate every day. It feels necessary to be in bed at a certain time and to try to get enough rest. That may not be true 6 months from now. But if we can think really critically about our ideas of work and how it impacts our relationship with ourselves and our relationship with our family members and our relationships with our coworkers and our relationship with our students, then I think we can start to challenge some of the family, culture, society, and religious notions of work that don't reflect our values. So I hope that you found this helpful. Again, feel free to visit the website and download the PDF. There are lots of other resources on there as well. There are guided meditations and there are links to the books that I've written, One Teenager at a Time. Is for educators and parents of teenagers, with lots of really good information in there about developing self-awareness and critical thinking using mindfulness and nonviolent communication. There are some great stories and discussion prompts in there that you can have with students or with your own kids. There's also a link to this book, The Self Project for Parents, which I wrote as sort of a companion to One Teenager at a Time for Parents. So there's a lot of good stuff. I'm going to do more of these videos. I have a whole series of them floating around in my head. I just haven't worked it all out yet. So keep checking the Self Project website or check YouTube to see if you can find some more of these. And I would love to hear your feedback. There's an email link at the website. So if you have questions about any of this, please email me through the link at the website so that I can know what kinds of things are on your mind and how I can help or maybe explain some things in a completely different way. So thank you for watching and be well.